We truly believe the gospel is not just something that we believe, but the gospel is a dynamic. And the gospel as a dynamic is something that enters our lives and then continually is changing and shaping us and forming us into the people that God hopes that we would become. And the reason that the gospel does that is this fundamental understanding that as human beings, we live in a broken world. We live in broken circumstances. We born into broken families. We deal with struggles and issues through the course of our life. And the gospel truly, through Jesus, continues to shape us and heal us and renew us. The reason that we're in this series, Right on the Money, is because in several different categories of life, there are places where we believe certain things or we behave certain ways, and the gospel truly has a contradictory way of calling us to live. The gospel actually enters into those areas of our life and challenges us to live in a way that's incredibly different from the way our culture or our society would. And when it comes to money, that's one of those areas I believe that as a practice, we have a general practice as Christ followers or as churches to really just accept the cultural norm when it comes to money. And yet that causes all sorts of tension and anxiety and issues in our own lives. And so truly the reason we're in this series is because we believe that the gospel has just as much impact on our finances and our personal approach to resources as it does any other area of our life. In fact, it's one of those areas because we seldom pause to look at the biblical perspective that very frequently we kind of lose perspective of just how different the biblical understanding of personal finance is from cultural understanding. That's really evident in what we're going to look at tonight. The passages that we're going to look at tonight and the process we're going to go through really reveals the very distinct line that's drawn between a gospel understanding of finance and what cultural finance is. The issue that we're looking at tonight, we actually want to start by talking about what I believe is one of the most significant factors that drives our spending habits and drives the way that we use our money. If there's one thing that's behind most of our spending, in fact, on the positive side, I mean, sometimes I shouldn't say positive, but sometimes to no effect, it's what motivates us. Sometimes the root cause of our stress, the reason that we have bills that we have trouble paying, the reason that we get into mortgages that are too big or we sign leases on cars that we don't want anymore, it's also the same driving factor behind those sorts of things. And this one thing, if you can understand and really wrap your mind around this one idea and how significant it is and the influence that it has in driving our decisions, truly there's an opportunity to revolutionize the way that you handle your money and then also experience really the benefits of joy and peace and calm around this issue. So radical perspective change. Here's the issue. Here's really what it boils down to. This is what drives our spending. It's what causes us to make horrible mistakes. It truly boils down to one issue, and it's discontentment. Discontentment. Most of our spending habits, most of the decisions we make, if you track back and say, how did I ever get here? Like if you look at the decision you made that now you wish you never would have around finances, time and time again, we can look back and it's usually around the idea of discontentment. And for the sake of the conversation tonight, I want to define this. This isn't a Webster's definition of discontentment. This is just for tonight's conversation. Discontentment is this. It is the dissatisfaction that I have with what I have. Does that make sense? It's the dissatisfaction that I have with what I have, with all the stuff that's in my life, all the things, whether it's the balance of my retirement account or my checking account, or if it's the newness of my car or the orderliness of my house. Discontent is us being dissatisfied with what we have. And that dissatisfaction, that discontentedness is what drives many of our decisions. Now, if that's what drives our decisions, if that's the engine behind those things, there's also a fuel that really fuels that engine. There's something that accelerates discontentment in our life. There's a word that I want to associate with discontent tonight, and it's a word that we don't typically think of in a negative sense. We usually think of it positively. The word is awareness. Usually we think about awareness of somebody increased our knowledge of something that was going on. Perfect example is Life Services. Tonight, I hope some of you became more aware of what an amazing ministry Life Services is. And we say, well, that's great. We raised our awareness, and now we know things that we didn't know before. Well, that same idea of awareness and now knowing things that we didn't know before is the fuel that drives discontentment. It's unbelievable to me how many times, and this is in my own life, and tonight I'm going to share as openly as I can about my own experience with this. It's unbelievable to me how content I can be with what I have until I see what somebody else has, right? Like, it's amazing, like, if you have a house and you've been living in that house for a while and you have a kitchen and it's just a regular kitchen, and somehow you go to a friend's house and their kitchen has taller ceilings and nicer finishes on the countertop and brand new stoves and stuff like that. It's an amazing thing that once you become aware of what other people have, you walk back into your house and you see the countertops you've been serving food on for 10 years and you think, I can't live like this, right? What happened? Awareness happened, right? Like somebody rolls up in a car and you get in their car and the smell of the leather seats, right? And the comfort and the climate control being automated. Like you get out of their car and back into your car and your car is never the same, right? You can ruin your car by being aware of how nice somebody else is, right? So for that reason, don't ever get in someone else's car, right? That's the lesson. We're done tonight. But awareness does this. The best example I can give you, this is like the iconic cultural example is this. Here it is. This is the best one. The TV, right? This is the best thing ever. How many of you notice this TV? This is like the Sony Triniton. I remember when I got one of these used, I was so excited that I got this TV. And I remember bringing it home, and I was like, this is awesome. Notice how big that thing is? Like, how many of you still have a TV with a box on the back of it like that? Anyone? Okay, a couple of you, proud of you? Proud of you? Yeah, good. It's hard to hang those on the wall, though, right? Like, you can't put that over the fireplace unless you have like a 4-foot mantle, right? Like putting that up there. But this is a great icon. This is a great example. It used to be that we were really content just to look at the front of the TV, right? Now, we care about the side of the TV, right? Now we're like, well, I want to see how thin this thing is and how light it is. I want this thing to be as paper thin and light as possible. And this is how the whole thing works, right? Some of you know exactly where I'm going with this. You used to have a TV like this. And then somebody invited you over to watch a football game, right? You went over to watch sports. And when you showed up, the TV was like the size of your living room, right? And you saw it. And immediately you thought to yourself, I have to have that, right? And you went home and you turned on your old box little TV and life was never the same, right? Like that TV never looked the same. Now you became aware there was something else, and then you find yourself just dropping by Best Buy on the way home from work because it's along the way, right? No, it's not, right? Or because you needed groceries? No, not because of that, right? You find yourself perusing the technology aisles of Fred Meyer, and you're looking at the TVs, and you're learning about LCD and all the different LED technology, and you find yourself doing this because you've become aware of something that you didn't previously have, and now you want it. Awareness is what fuels contentment. And this works with cars, it works with shoes, it works with houses, it works with kitchens, it works with cameras. Like, I'm going to keep naming things until I hit the thing that is your thing, right? I'll keep going because we all know this. Eventually you land on something, you go, yeah, you're right. All I have to do is learn about the new one, and I want it, right? Awareness fuels discontent. That's what awareness does. Not only does it fuel discontent, but it causes us to do something that we never would have done in the past. Back in the old days, we never upgraded anything. It used to be we replaced things when they broke. As a culture, if something broke, you replaced it. Now we took this term upgrade from the computer world, and we translated that to everyday life. And now we like to not just upgrade software so our computers run better. We like to upgrade our computers, and we like to upgrade everything else in our life, right? Upgrading means that we have something that works, but we find something that's shinier, newer, better, faster, and it replaces it in a better sort of way, so we decide we want it, and we upgrade. We upgrade so much, and here's just like a great simple truth in my house. We have a drawer in my house that if you open it, it's this one bottom drawer. If you open it, it is filled with old cell phones. Do you know what all of those phones have in common? They all still work. Yeah, they all still work. They're all still working. We still have working phones, some of them better than others, but they all still work, which means at some point we made the decision to take something that was working fine and upgrade it. Why would we do that? I remember my grandfather, he was an incredible craftsman. He could build anything, and every time we visited his house, he had a new project going, and so sometimes you'd show up and it was only a few weeks, and he had this massive thing that he had accomplished, and you're just like, how did you do this? So unbelievable craftsman, and just hardworking guy, and I just respected him so much. And after my grandmother died, there was all these tools that kind of somebody needed to take them. And at that time in my life, I didn't have a lot of tools, but I wanted tools. And I got so kind of like one of those moments, like, this is kind of cool. I'm going to get my grandpa's tools, which is kind of cool. And they're tools, which I need. And so that's, grandpa's such a great craftsman. He's going to have some awesome tools. And so I remember going out to the shed at my grandparents' property and opening this thing up. And I start opening drawers to see the tools that my grandfather had, the tools that he'd been using like week in, week out, forever, building these unbelievable, beautiful things. It was like an antique store inside his shop. I was like, what is this? Like, there were power tools that were like Power Tool 1.0, like the first power tools ever made. I was like, what in the world? Like, how did he even use this stuff, right? Like there were tools in there that seriously came out like when we discovered fire and carved the first wheel. That's how old this stuff was, like really old. And I remember thinking, like, why in the world didn't my grandpa upgrade this stuff? Like, why didn't he? And so I when I think back to this, it's interesting because I have this one kind of specific memory of realizing as I was looking through all these tools that with the power tools in particular, there were signs that my grandfather over the years had repaired them. Like when they broke, he didn't go buy a new one. Like when his screwdriver, like power drill thing broke, and when the cord broke, he didn't go get the one with the light and the level built in. He just put a new cord on it. And you could see signs that he'd put a new cord on. There were places where I literally could tell that he had taken the tools apart and replaced the brushes on the inside and rebuilt the tools. There were hand tools. There was evidence that he hand sharpened like blades and things that cost $5. And I'm just thinking, why didn't you just go buy a new one? And if I would ask my grandfather that, if I could go back in time and say to him, why in the world would you not just go buy this? After his look of disgust at me, I guarantee he would have said, because you don't replace things that work, right? Like you don't upgrade things. You use things until they wear out. There was this radical different perspective where for us today, we're always upgrading. We're always aware. We always know there's the next new thing. And because of this, we have stress in our lives. Because of our discontent, because we're aware of what someone else has, we stress when we don't have something, and then we leverage everything we've got. We put all the effort, we save and we scrimp, and then somehow we obtain it, and then we find ourselves stressed because now we've got to maintain whatever it is we saved for. We've got to pay the debt off on whatever it is that we bought, and so we live with stress in our lives because of our awareness, because of our discontent. We have relational issues with people because of our discontent. We have tension in marriages and families and friendships. We have regrets because of decisions that we made over our discontentedness, and we pay the price for it. Now, here's part of this that I think is the twist. Here's what I think we all need to understand. And what I'm about to say is not intuitive. This actually goes against what our culture says, and it goes against the way we normally think. And when I say this, you might start to agree with this, but maybe not at first. Our desire, your desire, my desire for bigger, better, faster, cleaner, more organized, whatever it is, the desire that we have that drives that sort of thinking or those sorts of behaviors, those are appetites. Whenever we want something else, whenever we need something else, whenever our discontent leads us to us wanting something else, that is an appetite. And here's what's interesting about appetites. Appetites are never fully or finally satisfied. That's the nature of something being an appetite. And if it's an appetite, it can never be satisfied. You've never sat down at a meal and finished the meal, and as you got done, you thought, you know what? I don't think I'm ever going to be hungry the rest of my life. Right? Except for Thanksgiving. That lasts for 15 minutes until you find out about pie. And then you go, no, I might have an appetite again, right? Because that's the way appetites work. Appetites, they're never fully or finally satisfied. You will always be hungry. You will always come back to a place of wanting more. That's something that's always going to return to you. The desire for more, the desire for nicer, the desire for better, or whatever it is, that is an appetite. Which means that no matter what you have, your appetite is going to drive you to want more than what you have right now. That's why we say things like, I think this is the last house that I'll ever buy. I think this is the last car. I have lost so much credibility with my wife by saying, I think this is the last car I'm going to buy for a long time. What makes us think that? Thank you for that. See, what's important to understand about appetites is this. And by the way, this appetites in this area it's true in every area we have appetites. Any place where we have a desire for something. So whether it's material goods or wealth or power or sex or whatever it is, appetites all work the same way. The truth about appetites is that the more you feed an appetite, the bigger that appetite gets. That's the way appetites work. Appetites, when you feed an appetite, if you decide to just continually feed your food appetite and you just go and go and go and you don't stop, what happens? Does your appetite go away? No. You just get hungrier and hungrier and you keep eating and eating and it doesn't go away. That's the way appetites work. It's true in every single category. And I know this is going to rock some of you and mess with your thinking a little bit because this is so different than what our culture says to us. But the only way that you curb an appetite, the only way that you allow it to diminish and for it to lose its control and power over your life is to limit the appetite, to starve the appetite, to actually deprive the appetite. That's what makes the appetite go away. It is not by feeding it. Feeding it just results in more hunger. Starving it actually allows you to move away from that appetite. That's the way it is in every area. I remember years ago I did kind of a series of longer fasts, and there was this one point where the first time I ever went over like a certain number of days, I realized, and I did this a couple of times, and I began to realize at about the end of day 2 or the end of day 3, and those of you that have ever fasted for a while, you realize that after a few days, your appetite, as strange as it is, starts to diminish. I remember when we lived in New York, there was this one day where I was going for like a 14-day fast, and Sherry walked in our living room one evening, and I literally was sitting there watching the Food Network and hadn't eaten in 10 days. And she looked at me and she goes, "What is wrong with you? Like, you are a sick individual." And I just said, "I'm not hungry." How do you explain that? How do you explain that based on our culture? You can't explain it except for the reality and the truth that says the only way to limit an appetite is to deprive the appetite. And so we live in a culture that says feed, 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 and we never get satisfied. We never feel full. We never seem like we have enough. And that's because we live in a culture that's lying to us. And the truth is we need to starve that appetite. With that in mind, that's kind of the groundwork, kind of the background for the passage that I want to look at tonight. And we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. And so if you have a Bible, open up to 1 Timothy 6. If you don't, the words will be on the screen. But we're going to look at 1 Timothy 6 because it addresses this whole idea of contentedness and awareness and appetites. 1 Timothy chapter 6 is one of 2 letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to this young man named Timothy, who was a young pastor that was kind of rising up to lead people in the gospel. And so Paul writes to Timothy with the purpose of unpacking for him, here are the things that you really need to know for your life. Like, here's how you live the gospel out, and then also here's how you challenge other people to live the gospel out. So when we pick up in 1 Timothy chapter 6, we're actually picking up right in the middle of this conversation, and in this conversation, he's addressing issues around wealth and money and finance. And the context of this, right in the middle of it, you're going to see there are things that come out of this and you go, wow, I know that phrase. Even if you haven't been around church world, you look at what gets said tonight and you say, I didn't know that was in the Bible, because some of the truths that get said tonight are things that have been around for 2,000 years because Paul wrote them to Timothy, which I think is something that should kind of raise our awareness that if this was an issue 2,000 years ago for humans living in that culture, and here we are living in this culture, that it's probably good for us to think about the same sorts of things. So I just want to jump in. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6, this is how we kind of begin our conversation tonight. He says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." And there's a comma. And I want to pause. That's what commas kind of help us do. I want to pause because this statement is one of those that we can blow past. We can read it. If you've been in the church a while, you go, yeah, that's cool. That sounds really good. But this one sentence absolutely turns the world upside down. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Not in our culture, right? In our culture, great gain means your 401k grew, right? Great gain means your house got bigger, your address got better, your car got shinier. That's great gain, right? I got a raise, like I got a new contract, I opened up a new business, whatever it is. That's what we would consider great gain. In our culture, great gain is typically referred to as some sort of physical, material, financial windfall that we receive. We say, I had great gains, and that means we made money, we got more stuff, we accumulated more. So when the Apostle Paul writes this, and he writes it into a culture that was just like ours in this way, he writes this, he completely undoes our thinking around what gain is. Like if you want to gain something, which there is something inside of all of us that says, I want more, I need more, there's this thing we kind of drive for. And Paul says, listen, if you want gain, if you want to really experience what great gain is, it's godliness with contentment. Which is just a revolutionary idea. None of us would ever land on this without hearing this sort of teaching. Like this is not something that our culture would ever tell us. Yeah, if you want great gain, just be content and godly. Which, by the way, those two ideas, I just want to define them real quickly. Godliness, oftentimes we hear godliness, and around Christian circles, godliness sometimes gets associated with somebody who's working really hard religiously, or it's associated with somebody who's jumping through the hoops, and they're checking all the boxes, and like showing up at all the church stuff, and using the right vocabulary, and their friends call them hypocrites and all that. That is not what godliness means. What godliness means is that a person's orientation in life has been reoriented around God, and they're in a place of allowing God to lead them. So they're living their life saying, I want my life to bring glory, to bring a good reputation for God, for people to love God more because of me in my life. That's what godliness truly is. The Apostle Paul says, if you do that, if you could somehow find yourself in your life reorienting to a place where you say, God, you're in control of my life. And not only that, I want to live my life in a way that people just smile at you because of me. He says that's great gain. That is great gain with contentment. Contentment. Like he says, if you can come to a place where you're just like, I'm all right. Like I don't need anything else. Where you're at peace with what you have. He says that, if like the opposite of gaining stuff, if you gained contentment, if somehow you could get to a place where it didn't matter what your neighbor was driving or how nice the countertops were or whatever it is, if it didn't matter how much money somebody had or what, like if you got to a place where none of that mattered and you suddenly got content, that would be great gain. And I think deep down, all of us know that that's true, don't we? All of us know there is something intrinsically inside of us that says, if I could become content, wow, what an amazing feeling. Now, he moves on, and really we understand why this makes sense in verse 7. He says this. He says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of the world. Do you know why godliness and contentment are great gain? Because all the stuff we associate with great gain, when we die, somebody else gets it. So how could that truly be gain? How could something that's never really ours be gain in the first place? And so Paul says, I want you to rethink your stuff, and I want you to rethink the acquisition of stuff, and I want you to rethink your money. I want you to rethink these things. And then verse 8, he says this to Timothy. He says, but if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Like he boils it down. He says, okay, like I know we all struggle with contentment. He says, listen, what contentment boils down to, like if you've got food, if you've got clothing, like if you're sleeping indoors, you've got more than enough. He says, if you've got that, we will be content. And here's what's interesting. When I read that, there's this little part of me that goes, good for you, Paul and Timothy. Because I haven't reached a point yet. Like there's a little part of me, my first response is, man, I don't know. Like I struggle personally with whether or not I really can be content with those things. On a very honest level, I will say to all of you, for me, I struggle. And when I hear that, I go, I don't know if I am content. I don't know if I can be content with just food or clothing. Like that's my first thought because, I just think about my life. And there's kind of this, some of you may be like me, some of you may not be like me, but there's kind of this part of my personality that's like sick and twisted where I'm always trying to improve my situation. It doesn't matter what I have or where I live or what I'm living in or whatever, I'm always improving. I work for it, I compete for it. I'm always trying to just get things just a little bit better, a little bit nicer, always kind of playing this game, trying to move things up. And so when I hear Paul say, I can be content with just food and clothing, there's a part of me that goes, I don't know if I can be content with just food or clothing. But then when I think a little deeply about this, and when I think about conversations I have with people, I realize maybe I can be. For those of you that maybe you've lived like a little bit more of life, like you have a few more miles on the chassis than maybe some other people that are in the room, if I asked you and I said to you, when were you the most content in your life? And I don't want you to answer this, but if I asked you that question, based on what our culture tells us, based on what society is selling us all the time, the answer to the question of when are you the most content, the answer should be when I had the most stuff. Based on culture, my contentedness, there should be a direct correlation that when it was at a peak, when my house was biggest and my car was newest and the money was greatest in my checking account, that was the point in time in which I was the most satisfied. I was as happy as ever. I just had so much contentment. Here's what's fascinating. When I talk to people who have lived some life and I ask that question, or when I answer that question for somebody else, time and time again, here's what I discover. And it's so revealing and it's so life-giving. I hear people say things like, oh man, when we first got married, we lived in this apartment, and it was like $200 a month, and we had crates for furniture, and the bed was lumpy, and there were neighbors that were loud, and we had one car that never ran, and we were working for minimum wage. Like, and they tell the story, and then you like watch them like go back to this place where like you had nothing, and yet you were content. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was telling somebody, I was talking about, I love backpacking and camping, and I was talking about how there are very few places that I feel as content as when I'm in the woods, sitting in a lawn chair or in a field somewhere. And I can't explain that because there's a part of me that often wonders, like camping is so much work and backpacking, it's so much work to go do this. And yet the thing that I always experience is that in the simplicity of the moment, when I have nothing around me, there are no comforts, there's no running water, when everything like has been boiled down to its bare minimum, somehow in those moments, I'm content. Which tells me that as much as my first response and your first response may be, I don't know if I could be content with just food and clothing, the truth is we probably have been. You already have experienced it. Sometimes you're longing for it. Sometimes you're pursuing it. We just don't pursue it the way that Paul talks about here. So Paul would listen to us talk about this and he would say, exactly. Exactly. Paul would say to all of us, listen, I know plenty of people who have way more than I do and they're way less content than I am. So in verse 9, he continues. He keeps unpacking this. He says, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. So he starts off with this idea, those that desire to be rich, and there's this concept that he's unpacking. He's not talking about any specific social strata. He's not saying that there's a certain level where this becomes a problem. He's saying that at every single level, it doesn't matter where you are, if you begin to make the desire of your heart to continually be moving up the ladder, to get more stuff, to acquire, to claim more, to have more, if that becomes the purpose of your life, if that's what you're doing, then there are consequences to orienting your life around that. And it's not like a could be. It's not like, hey, if you live that way, there could be some bad stuff. No, it's a will be. There will be consequences. If you try to live richly or you pursue this increased lifestyle continually, if that's what you make your life about, he literally says it's a trap, it's a snare, and you fall into temptation. And that's a promise. And that's why you look at people that win the lottery and they have millions of dollars, or ball players that get amazing contracts, how somehow they end up bankrupt. How is that even possible? It's possible because there's a snare. When you begin to obsess about the lifestyle and the living and all of these things, it becomes dangerous. Discontentment is dangerous. And if we allow it to shape our appetites and our desires, if we let our discontent drive us, it will also ruin us. It doesn't matter where you are on the ladder. It ruins everybody equally. Then in the next verse, in verse 10, he says something that maybe you've heard before. This is one of those, maybe you didn't know it was in the Bible statements, but he says this, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. How many of you have heard that one before? Okay, good. There's like 4 of you. That's good. No, I'm just kidding. No, the love of money is the root of all evils. I think this is funny. When someone says this to you, you go, like, if you've ever had somebody sarcastically say that to you, that's always fun. Well, the love of money, and they're like speaking right to you. You're like, thank you for that. When somebody says, like, do you love money? My response to that, I usually want to say something like, yeah, I like money. I don't love money, right? Like, we're seeing each other right now, money and I, right? We've got a relationship. We're kind of dating, Money and I. We're kind of hanging out, not sure where this thing's going to go. But love's a big word. I'm not sure that I love money, and I'm not sure I'm ready to say that I love money. That's how I respond. Like all of us, we say, like, do you love money? This is a phrase that's common enough that most of us know it. We've heard it. We know it's bad, so none of us fess up to it, right? None of us go, yeah, I love money. No, we just dance all around this because the love of money is very difficult for us to see in the mirror. The love of somebody else is very easy to see in the mirror, right? When we love somebody else and we passionately love them and it's like red hot burning love, that's something you actually can see, right? When Sherry and I first met, it was amazing. Like, there were things that I did when we were first meeting each other that were unbelievable. Things that, like, I look back on and I feel guilty today for sharing these stories because it's been a long time since I did anything like this. But I remember I had this old truck that got horrible gas mileage, and I lived way across the town in Phoenix from her. And I remember driving 30 minutes so that I could see her face for 3, right? Like 30 minutes I would drive and spend all kinds of gas money, and I was a poor working college student. And all I had to do was pick up the phone, but there was no way I would settle with that. I just wanted to see her face, right? And make sure no other guys were hanging around. That was the other part of it, right? Because that's always part of it. I remember there was this one time, she had these roommates, and we weren't even dating yet, and I was kind of like taking the How Not to Be a Jerk class that Life Services offered. And so I went to her apartment one morning early. I was working in construction, and I got bagels and cream cheese from this really cool place, and I got a newspaper from the Oregonian from Portland, and we were in Phoenix. I thought that was cool. I hunted that down, and I got some orange juice and some frappuccinos and I brought them and I left them like in a basket at their doorstep. Like, you talk about creepy, right? Like, left it there and then went to work. And all day, like, there's that whole tension of, is she going to like totally think I'm a psycho, or is she going to like actually start dating me? Like, which one is it going to be? You do those things when you love somebody, right? Like, when you were just like head over heels, you do crazy, out of the norm things that you would seldom do apart from love. So we can see it when it's love for another person. But if you flip that around and you think about that and reverse it towards our approach to things, to stuff, think about all the crazy things that you have done to accumulate something. Think about the way you have dedicated your money, or the way that you have sacrificed relationships, or the way that you've given of your time so that you could have an object. Think about the way that maybe you've signed a contract or made a deal with somebody or traded something away only to end up with something where you say, why did I ever do this? Well, you did that. I did that. I've done that because of my love of money, my love of stuff. That's what that looks like. Welcome to America. That's the culture that we live in every single day. That is our way of life. Our culture is built around the love of money and stuff, and it wrecks us. Check this out, verse 10. Paul just continues on, and it's so relevant to us. He says, it is through this craving. I love that word because it just reminds us of the whole appetite thing. It's the appetite. It's this craving that we continue to give into. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with major pangs. He says, listen, this is so big. Like, these appetites are so demanding that when you start to give in to them, they actually will take you from a place of faithfulness towards God, and you will walk away. Some of us know that, right? We know what it's like when we throw ourselves at this stuff, and then we find ourselves kind of like wandering back into church one day, and we go, where have I been? Like, what happened? What happened was cravings, right? We go all in on this. And it sucks the life from us. It steals life from us. And we discover nothing but emptiness because of it. When we experience those kinds of moments, the Apostle Paul predicted that 2,000 years ago. He's like, man, what did you think was going to happen? I've been telling you this for a while. Verse 11, he says this to Timothy. He's talking about people in general. And he says, but as for you, O man of God, flee these things and pursue righteousness, pursue godliness, pursue faith, pursue love, pursue steadfastness, pursue gentleness. That's what he says. But as for you, I love this because when he says, but as for you, know what he's saying? He's like saying, you don't have to live this way. He's saying you can be caught in the snare and you can give into your cravings and all these things, but he goes, but you know what, as for you, and he says it to you guys, he says, listen, as for you, you don't have to live this way. Like, you don't have to do this. There's another option for you. He literally uses this terminology. I think it's so important to look at. He says you need to flee these desires. You need to flee the discontentment. Flee these things. Not flirt with these things. Not tempt yourself. Not toy with these things. You don't poke the bear when the bear is about to maul you, right? You don't mess with these things. You flee these things. You know, there's so many times we look at the discontentment in our awareness issues, and then we find ourselves perusing catalogs. And I'm guilty of this as anyone else. Perusing catalogs, and we walk through malls, and we kind of kill time looking at window shops and all these different. We think about the stuff we do, just shopping and looking and thinking and talking about all the different stuff. All of it looks like flirting with something that Paul says is incredibly, inordinately dangerous for our lives. Why would we do this? Flee these things and pursue. This idea of pursuing is like you shift directions, you run away, and then you pursue with fervency. You put effort towards not increasing your awareness of what you have, but towards righteousness and godliness and love and faith and steadfastness and gentleness. He says, pursue those things. Go after those things hard. And when he says that, that's where we can draw the line and say, gospel thinking around personal finance is so radically different than culture. No wonder we don't gravitate towards this naturally. It's so different. We want more stuff. And Paul says, you need more God. You need more of him. And here's what's challenging in this, and I'll just throw this out. There's a chance that for some of you, you read that and you hear me say it, and you go, well, I kind of expected that to be said in church. And while you may not say this out loud, what you may think internally and what you may be wrestling with is the option between continuing to pursue materialism and stuff and things in our culture or to pursue godliness and love. Like, there's a part of you that when you hear that, you go, option number 2 sounds kind of boring. Doesn't sound as exciting, doesn't sound as fun. Like righteousness and godliness and faith and love and endurance and gentleness. I expect that to be said in church, but there's no like fire with that. There's no like something that kind of stirs up passion inside of you. Like you look at that and you go, that's okay, I'll do that sort of thing. You know why we think that way? Because we still believe the lie of culture. If we for a moment think that pursuing stuff, the acquisition of things, the accumulation of wealth, if somehow we think that is more attractive or more satisfying than righteousness or godliness or faith or love, all that means is we continue to be deceived and we're living completely immersed in the cultural lie that says stuff is where you define your life. And nothing defines us like God does. Nothing satisfies us like God does. That is the only place that we experience deep satisfaction, which is what Paul is driving towards. Because of time, I want to skip down to verse 18. This is what he says in verse 18. He goes to Timothy and says, hey, this is what you've got to tell other people. This is what you need to tell other people. This is how you keep this from happening in their life and in your life. He says, tell them this, they're to do good, to be rich in good works, and to be generous and ready to share. Which, by the way, that whole sharing thing, when you don't have a lot of new, shiny stuff, it gets a lot easier to share, right? It's always hard. When you get something brand new and then somebody goes, hey, can I borrow that? You're like, yeah. And you just like never answer their calls ever again because you're afraid, right? The Apostle Paul says, hey, you want to combat this? Then do good. Like, tell them to do good and to be rich in good works. If you want to accumulate some sort of wealth, let it be a wealth of examples of you doing great and wonderful things for other people. Be a person who's generous and you're ready to share. You're ready just to say, if somebody wants this, they can take it. Do you know what all of those things assume when you put them and line them all up? All of them have an awareness issue, but it's the exact opposite of the awareness issue that we started with. All of these, if you're going to do good works, be rich in good works, but be generous and ready to share, if that's going to be your orientation, it means that somehow you have moved your vision from your life and what you're lacking to the lives of other people and other individuals around you, and now you're acknowledging what they need. Your awareness is now not what you don't have. Your awareness is now what they don't have. And Paul says, listen, if you want to combat the destructive nature of this, become aware of what other people don't have. I'll tell you, like personally, I just want to say this. I love nice stuff. I struggle with this. Like materialism is one of my personal battles that I wrestle with all the time. I like nice stuff. But I'll tell you, there's nothing that stops me in my tracks from spending money on ridiculous things, like being aware of what's going on in the world or in my community or in my city or in my friendships. And I go, I can't justify spending that kind of money when I know, and then I fill in the blank with whatever the need is. There's this radical reorientation. He says, do good, be rich, become aware of what other people have. And then I love the way he wraps this up. He says, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future. That's a good foundation for the future. So that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And in that moment right there, he says, all this other stuff we're grasping, all the other things we're trying to take hold of, the materialism, all of those things are like shifting sands through our fingers. There's nothing that we can grasp or take a hold of. But he says this is something that you can grab onto. This is genuine life. This, as immaterial as it is the most concrete thing that you will ever experience in your life. So don't give in to the consumerism. Fight the discontent in your life. Wrestle to continue to do good and be aware of what's happening with others. And as you do, God is going to reshape, reform your heart. And as he reshapes and reforms your heart, your contentedness in life will increase, and your peace around finances will increase, and your joy will increase. And if you do that as an individual, and I do that as an individual, then we become a community that becomes an example to a world around us that is drowning in debt and emptiness and shifting sands. And people will look to us and they'll look to you and say, how is it that you're navigating life with such peace and with such joy? How is it that the ups and downs of stock markets and losses and gains, and how come your life isn't defined by the newness of your... Like, they will come to you and you will be a voice of hope and reason because you've experienced it yourself. That's what Paul wants for us. Be content. Be aware of what's going on in other people's lives and grasp what is truly something tangible that you can hold on to. Let's pray. Would you stand with me and we'll pray together? Lord, this is a hard issue, and it's a hard issue with me, and I know for anyone in the room right now that has heard these words and they just kind of sting a little, I know that this is a heart thing. This is me recognizing that the places in my own life where I'm insecure, I try to fill it with stuff. I try to fill places where I want meaning with money. There's places where reputation is something I associate with what I have or my address or something else. And Lord, I pray for all of us that are hearing these words tonight, that they would penetrate deeply into our hearts, and that we would know that who we are, our value, our identity, our quality of life, all of these things are not determined by the balance of our checking account or the address on our house or the finishes in our bathrooms, but that we are defined ultimately by you, and you have told us of your great love for us. Let us walk in, let us live in the confidence that comes when our hearts are secure in you. I pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.